welcome to our study on the Book of Mormon, and we're trying to ascertain who really did write this book. Is it from God or is it from man? And as we've studied, we've looked at some great historical evidence that pinpoints that Sidney Rigdon was behind a stolen manuscript of a man named Solomon Spaulding in Pittsburgh, who had stolen this manuscript and turned it into what is known as the Book of Mormon. Now we've been looking at the Conneaut witnesses, where we see Solomon Spaulding once lived in Conneaut, Ohio, in which there were certain people, friends, relatives, neighbors, who Solomon Spaulding, who had wrote his book and was reading it to them, and they remembered basically when he read it to them, and it was very familiar to them when the Book of Mormon was published and it was read to them. They said that that was the work of Solomon Spaulding, and we read their testimonies. Now, we see that years later, in 1839, we see that Rigdon, he denies any involvement that he was in regards to Solomon Spaulding, because we see that Solomon Spaulding's wife, who is now a widow, she writes a letter to a newspaper and says that this was Sidney Rigdon that stole that manuscript. And so let's read the newspaper account and what it says. It says, "As this book has excited much attention and has been put by a certain new sect in the place of the sacred scriptures, I deem it a duty which I owe to the public to state what I know touching its origin. That its claim to be a divine origin are wholly unfounded, needs no proof to a mind unperverted by the grossest delusions. That any sane person should rank it higher than any other merely human composition is a matter of the greatest astonishment, yet it is received as divine by some who dwell in enlightened New England, and even by those who have sustained the character of devoted Christians. Learning recently that Mormonism had found its way into a church in Massachusetts and has impregnated some of its members with its grossest delusions, so that excommunication has been necessary, I am determined to delay no longer doing what I can do to strip the mask from this monster of sin and to lay open this pit of abominations." Reverend Solomon Spaulding, to whom I was united in marriage in early life, was a graduate of Dartmouth College and was distinguished for a lively imagination and a great fondness for history. At the time of our marriage, he resided in Cherry Valley, New York. From this place, we removed to New Salem, Ashtabula County, Ohio, sometimes called Conneaut, as it is situated upon Conneaut Creek. Shortly after our removal to this place, his health sunk, and he was laid aside from active labors. In the town of New Salem, there are numerous mounds and forts, supposed by many to be the dilapidated dwellings and fortifications of a race now extinct. These ancient relics arrest the attention of the new settlers and became objects of research for the curious. Numerous implements were found and other articles evincing great skill in the arts. Mr. Spaulding, being an educated man and passionately fond of history, took a lively interest in these developments of antiquity, and in order to beguile the hours of retirement and furnish employment for his lively imagination, he conceived the idea of giving a historical sketch of this long-lost race. The extreme antiquity, of course, would lead him to write in the most ancient style, and as the Old Testament is the most ancient book in the world, he imitated its style as nearly as possible. His sole object in writing this historical romance was to amuse himself and his neighbors. This was about the year 1812. Hull's surrender at Detroit occurred near the same time, and I recollect the date well from that circumstance. As he progressed in his narrative, the neighbors would come in from time to time to hear portions read, and a great interest in the work was excited among them. It claimed to have been written by one of the lost nation and to have been recovered from the earth, and assumed the title of manuscript found. The neighbors would often inquire how Mr. Spaulding, Mr. S., progressed in deciphering the manuscript, and when he had sufficient portion prepared, he would inform them, and they would assemble to hear it read. He was enabled from his acquaintance with the classics in ancient history to introduce many singular names, which were particularly noticed by the people and could be easily recognized by them. Mr. Solomon Spaulding had a brother, Mr. John Spaulding, residing in the place at the time, who was perfectly familiar with this work and repeatedly heard the whole of it read. From New Salem, we removed to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here Mr. Spaulding found an acquaintance and friend in the person of Mr. Patterson, an editor of the newspaper. He edited his manuscript to Mr. P., who was very much pleased with it, and borrowed it for perusal. He retained it a long time and informed Mr. Spaulding that if he would make out a title page and preface, he would publish it, and it might be a source of profit. This Mr. Spaulding refused to do for reasons which I cannot now state. Sidney Rigdon, who has figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, who was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as is well known in that region. And as Rigdon himself has frequently stated, here he had ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spaulding's manuscript and to copy it if he chose. It was a matter of notoriety and interest to all who were connected with the printing establishment. At length, the manuscript was returned to its author, and soon after we removed it to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Spaulding died in 1816. The manuscript then fell into my hands and was carefully preserved. It has frequently been examined by my daughter, Mrs. McKinstry of Monson, Massachusetts, with whom I now reside, and by other friends. After the Book of Mormon came out, a copy of it was taken to New Salem, the place of Mr. Spaulding's residence and the place where the manuscript found was written. A woman preacher appointed a meeting there, and in the meeting read and repeated copious extracts from the Book of Mormon. For some reason, the woman preacher should actually be Mormon preacher, but for some reason they messed up on that, just to let you know. The historical part was immediately recognized by all the older inhabitants as the identical work of Mr. Spaulding, in which they had been so deeply interested years before. Mr. John Spaulding was present, who is an eminently pious man, and recognized perfectly the work of his brother. He was amazed and afflicted that it should have been perverted to so wicked a purpose. His grief found vent in a flood of tears, and he arose on the spot and expressed to the meeting his deep sorrow and regret that the writings of his sainted brother should be used for a purpose so vile and shocking. The excitement in New Salem became so great that the inhabitants had a meeting and deputed Dr. Philastus Hulbert, one of their number, to repair to this place and to obtain from me the original manuscript of Mr. Spaulding for the purpose of comparing it with the Mormon Bible, to satisfy their own minds and to prevent their friends from embracing an error so delusive. This was in the year 1834. Dr. Herbert brought with him an introduction and request for the manuscript, signed by Messrs. Lake, Aaron Wright, and others, with all whom I was acquainted, and as they were my neighbors when I resided in New Salem. I am sure that nothing could grieve my husband more, were he living, than the use which had been made of his work. The air of antiquity which was thrown about the composition doubtless suggested the idea of converting it to the purposes of delusion. Thus, an historical romance, with the addition of a few pious expressions and extracts from the sacred Scriptures, has been construed into a new Bible and palmed off upon a company of poor deluded fanatics as divine. I have given the previous brief narration in this work of deep deception and wickedness may be searched to the foundation, and its author exposed to contempt and extrication he so justly deserves. So as you can see, Mrs. Davidson, who was Solomon Spaulding's wife, she gives us a newspaper article. She gives us great details on what her husband had written of this manuscript found and how it had fallen into the hands of Sidney Rigdon and used for such a wicked purpose of using it as a new Bible, as added scriptures. So that's why it's very important to see that Sidney Rigdon, he writes an article back to the newspaper. Of course, it's found in another newspaper, but he responded to her letter. And I want you to listen very carefully to what Sidney Rigdon wrote, because we see that there are some things that he says that we're going to look at very carefully. And this is what he has to say. He says, in your paper of the 18th, I see a letter signed by somebody calling herself Matilda Davidson, pretending to give the origin of Mormonism, as she is pleased to call it, by relaying a moonshine story about a certain Solomon Spaulding, a creature with the knowledge of whose earthly existence I am entirely indebted to this production, for surely until Dr. Philastus Hulbert informed me that such a being lived, some former period, I had not the most distant knowledge of his existence. Now, it may be true that he had not the most distant knowledge, but he did have nearby knowledge, did he not? That he was very acquainted with Solomon Spaulding because they shared the same post office, and because he did have the possible access to stealing Solomon Spaulding's manuscript. So he goes on to say, and all I had now know about his character is the opinion I formed from which is attributed to his wife in obtruding my name upon the public in the manner in which she is said to have done it, by trying to make the public believe that I had knowledge of the ignorant, and according to her own testimony, the lying scribblings of her deceased husband. For if her testimony is to be credited, her pious husband in his lifetime wrote a bundle of lies for the righteous purpose of getting money. How many lies he had told for the same purpose while he was preaching, she had not so kindly informed us. But we are at liberty to draw our own conclusions. For he that would write lies to get money would also preach lies for the same object, this being the only information which I have, or ever had, of this same Reverend Solomon Spaulding. I of necessity have had a very light opinion of him as a gentleman, a scholar, or a man of piety. For had he been either, he certainly would have taught his pious wife not to lie, not unite herself with adulterers, liars, and the basis of mankind. It is only necessary to say in relation to the whole story about Spaulding's writings being in the hands of Mr. Patterson, who was in Pittsburgh, and who is said to have kept a printing office, and my saying that I was concerned in said office, etc., etc., is the most base of lies, without even the shadow of truth. There was no man by the name of Patterson during my residence at Pittsburgh who had a printing office. What might have been before I lived there, I know not. Mr. Robert Patterson, I was told, had owned a printing office before I lived in that city, but I had been unfortunate in business and failed before my residence there. This Mr. Patterson, who was a Presbyterian preacher, I had a very slight acquaintance with during my residence in Pittsburgh. He was then acting under an agency in the book and stationery business, and was the owner of no property of any kind, printing office, or anything else, during the time I resided in the city. If I were to say that I ever heard of the Reverend Solomon Spaulding and his hopeful wife until Dr. P. Harbert wrote his lie about me, I should be a liar unto themselves. Why was not the testimony of Mr. Patterson obtained to give force to the shameful tale of lies? The only reason is that he was not a fit tool for them to work with. He would not lie for them, for if he were called on, he would testify to what I have here said. Let me here, gentlemen, give a history of this Dr. P. Harbert and his associates who aided in getting up and propagating this batch of lies. Now, it's very important to look at just part of the statement of his letter that he just wrote. He says, why don't you obtain the testimony of Mr. Patterson? He says, if you obtain his testimony, he would surely tell you if I had maybe stolen Solomon Spaulding's manuscript. Now, it's very interesting to clarify that what maybe Sidney Rigdon is doing is trying to lead us off the track. Do you remember I told you that there were two Patterson brothers who worked for this R&J Patterson firm? And that he says he talked about Robert Patterson. But what about the other brother, Joseph Patterson? You see, maybe it's the case that they were trying to get him the people to think about in his letter Robert Patterson, which probably had nothing to do with Solomon Spaulding's manuscript. It was actually Joseph Patterson who worked with Solomon Spaulding. But you see, he's trying to get us off the track to obtain Robert Patterson's testimony, whom we would know that Robert Patterson, if we were to talk to him, he wouldn't know anything because he didn't deal with Solomon Spaulding. So you can see how Sidney Rigdon might got us off the track with his in that part of the statement of his letter. Now, let me just tell you about Robert Patterson just a little bit, that he said he did not have any dealings with Solomon Spaulding, so that's why it must have been Joseph Patterson. Furthermore, we know, sadly, in R&J Patterson firm, there were some guys who died who might have known that Sidney Rigdon had stolen the manuscript, such as Harrison Lambden, who was a close friend of Sidney Rigdon. He died in 1825. It's 3 years before the Book of Mormon was published. And then Silas Ingalls, who was also part of that, he actually died in 1827. He was the one who said that Sidney Rigdon was always hanging about the printing office. So these would not be able to get eyewitness testimony from them because sadly they had already died. And then, of course, Joseph Patterson had already moved off from Pittsburgh. He moved away from there, and so they weren't able to obtain his testimony. Well, listen very carefully to what else Sidney Rigdon says. He says, I have seen and heard at one time and another by the persecutors and haters of the truth a great deal said about the eminent physician Dr. Holbert. I never thought the matter worthy of notice, nor probably ever should, had it not made its appearance in your paper, or someone of equal respectability. And I believe, gentlemen, had you have known the whole history of the budget of lies, it would never have found a place in your paper, but to my history. This said doctor was never a physician at any time nor anything else, but a base ruffian. He was the seventh son, and his parents called him doctor. It was his name and not the title of his profession. He once belonged to the Methodist Church and was excluded for immoralities. He afterwards imposed himself on the Church of Latter-day Saints and was excluded for using obscene language to a young lady, a member of said church, who resented his insult with indignation, which became both her character and profession. After his exclusion, he swore, for he was vilely profane, that he would have revenge, and commenced his work. He soon found assistance a pious old deacon of the Campbellite church by the name of Honest Clapp, with his two sons, Thomas J. Clapp and Matthew S. Clapp, both Campbellite preachers, abetted and assisted by another Campbellite preacher by the name of Absalom Bentley. Harbert went to work catering lies for the company. Before Harbert got through, his conduct became so scandalous that the company utterly refused to let his name go out with the lies which he had collected, and he and his associates had made, and they substituted the name of E.D. Howe. The change, however, was not much better. There are more scandalous immoralities about the Howe family of so black a character that they had nothing to lose, and became good tools for this holy company to work with. Harbert laid hold of him and called for help, which soon came to his assistance. The pious old deacon was arraigned before a justice of the peace, and was on the eve of being bound over for his appearance to the county court, when to put an end to the evils which might result from his pious care of Mistress Hulbert, he kindly offered a yoke of oxen and $100. This was accepted. Hulbert took his wife and left the country forthwith, and the pious old deacon and his sons and the good Mr. Bentley are left to wear out the shame of their great effort to destroy the character of innocent men, whom they never dare meet in argument. The tale in your paper is one hatched up by this gang before the time of their explosion. It has always been a matter of no ordinary satisfaction to me to know that my enemies have no better weapon to use against me, or the cause in which I am engaged, than lies. For if they had any better, they would certainly use them, I must confess. However, that there is some constancy in our persecutors, for as truth never can destroy truth, it would be in vain for our persecutors to use truth against us, for this would only build us up, that this would seem to know and lay hold of the only available means they have, which are lies. And this indeed is the only weapon which can be or ever has been used against the truth. As our persecutors are endeavoring to stop the progress of truth, I must confess that they act with a degree of consistency in the choice of the means, namely lies. But if truth would do so, they would surely not have recourse to lies. In order to give character to their lies, they dress them up with a great deal of piety, for a pious lie, has a good deal more influence with an ignorant people than a profane one. Hence their lies come signed by the pious wife of a pious deceased priest. However, the last act of piety seems to have been to write a bundle of lies, themselves being witnesses, but then his great piety sanctifies them, and lies become holy things in the hands of such excessive piety, particularly when they are graced with a few reverence. For the days who have gone by when people are to be deceived by these false glossings of reverend sanctions, the intelligent part of the communities of all parts of the country know that reverends are not more notorious for truth than their neighbors. The other reason why I am assailed by lies is that my opposers dare not adventure an argument, knowing that if they do, the opposers dare not adventure an argument, knowing that if they do, they fall. They try, therefore, to keep the public from investigating by publishing and circulating falsehoods. Then I consider a high encomium on both myself and the cause I defend. So as you can see, what Solomon Spaulding would write here, Sidney Rigdon would write here in his letter against the letter of Solomon Spaulding's wife. And we see how he says, hey, there's a bunch of lies that are going around about me, and they're not true. And so you can see why Sidney Rigdon would try to defend himself. Now, it's very important to give heed to what is said next, because, when we think about what makes a historical event true, it's usually an event that is very embarrassing. Just think about what the Bible, in regards to how it is historically reliable. You can't help but think about Peter. If Peter wanted to, think about the book of Matthew and Mark, how it records, when Jesus was on trial, what did Peter do? Well, remember that Jesus had told Peter that he would deny him 3 times. And we see this account, a historical account, in the Bible. Now, if you were Peter, would you want that to remain in the historical record that you had denied the Christ 3 times? No, it's embarrassing, right? Well, that's why it would make it actually more true that the embarrassing account actually stays in the Word of God. And we see this a lot throughout the Bible of what we would call embarrassing accounts. Another example you might think about is in regards to who were the first eyewitnesses of the empty tomb. Well, it was women. During that culture and time, people didn't really have a high regard for women. So it's very interesting that the first eyewitnesses of the empty tomb of Christ are women, which provides that embarrassing criterion that show the historical reliability of the Bible. Well, I want to refer to you what was reported in 1888 by Sidney Rigdon's grandson, where he reveals the family secret. Because Sidney Rigdon, he says, "I testify in the presence of this congregation and before God and all the holy angels up yonder, pointing toward heaven, before whom I expect to give account of the judgment day, that I never saw a sentence of the Book of Mormon. I never penned the sentence of the Book of Mormon. I never knew that there was such a book in existence as the Book of Mormon until it was presented to me by Parley P. Pratt in the form that it now is." Now that's very interesting because of what we run into with his grandson, who reports an embarrassing criterion. In a newspaper account, you'll find it says this: "In the intervals of my literary labors, here I have many talks with men who were in Utah at a very early day and occasionally with original Mormons or their sons. My chance talks with one of these are so agreeable that I report him briefly for you. Mr. Walter Sidney Rigdon is a citizen of Carrollton, Contanogus County, New York, and a grandson of Sidney Rigdon, the partner of Joe Smith. He talked with old Sidney hundreds of times about the scheme of the Golden Bible, and his father still has many of the old Sidney documents. Grandfather was a religious crank," says Mr. Rigdon, "till he lost money by it. He started in as a Baptist preacher, and he had very fine congregation for those days in Pittsburgh. There was no reason at all for his leaving except that he got cracked. At that time, he had no idea of making money. Indeed, while he was with the Mormons, his chances to make money were good enough for most men, but he came out of it about as poor as he went in." Mr. Beadle, the reporter, says this, "But how did he change first?" He asked the question of his grandson. And this is the grandson's reply. "Well, he tried to understand the prophecies, and a man who does that is sure to go crazy. He studied the prophets and baptism, and of course he got rattled. Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelations will rattle any man who gives into his whole mind to them. At any rate, they did him, and he joined Alexander Campbell. Campbell then believed that the end of the world was nigh. His millennial harbinger shows that they had rattled all who listened to him in Ohio and other places. Then grandfather got disgusted and decided on a new deal. He found Joe Smith, and they had a great many talks together before they brought out the plates. None of us ever doubted that they got the whole thing up, but father always maintained that grandfather helped get up the original Spalding book. At any rate, he got a copy very early and schemed on some way to make it useful. Although the family knew these facts, they refused to talk on the subject while grandfather lived. In fact, he and they took on a great discuss on the whole subject. I only report that part of Mr. Rigdon's talk, which shows the history of the Golden Bible as accepted in the family. Of course, if Sidney Rigdon had wanted the world to believe the Smith story of the plates, he would have told them so. But though the family do not care to ventilate it, he evidently taught them to treat the whole thing as a fraud. Now that's very important for us to understand, friends, in regards to this matter, because we see that here's a grandson who reveals the family secret. Here's someone who says, my grandfather is the one who took Solomon Spaulding's work and made it into what is known as the Book of Mormon. It was never from God. It was made up. It came from man. See how embarrassing that would be to a family? See how it would be so embarrassing to a grandson to actually say that about his grandfather? Obviously, that was probably hard for him to say. But nevertheless, it is the truth. Because we see that there are more eyewitnesses that give rise to saying that this man, Sidney Rigdon, is responsible for stealing Solomon Spaulding's manuscript and turning it into the Book of Mormon. Friend, you can see that as the Bible says, 1 John 4 verse 1, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see if they are of God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. That's why we're doing this investigation. We're looking at the study. We're trying to carefully examine. And we see that the Book of Mormon is found wanting when we look in the history of it, how it was compiled, how it was actually made, that it actually came from mere men, and that it didn't really come from God. So I ask you to please look at your faith and ask yourself, do you really want to put your faith in this book when you see all the eyewitness testimony that says that it came from Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found